The nail made a sound like a tooth breaking. Mr. Davies drove it through the eviction notice and into the doorframe of the sod house with a single, practiced strike of his hammer. The paper, cheap and thin, fluttered against the weathered wood, a pale flag of surrender. Wind tore across the plains, carrying the first crystalline bite of winter. It was a dry, scouring wind that promised a bad season. Abel stood motionless, watching the official seal on the document. His hands, stained with the dirt of the land he was losing, were clenched at his sides. Beside him, his mother, Miriam, drew her shawl tighter, her face as still and carved as the landscape. Her breathing was a shallow whisper against the wind's howl. A brown shaggy dog, Moss, pressed against her leg, a low growl vibrating in its chest. "The council's decision is final," Davies said, not looking at Abel, but at the horizon. He was a man who preferred dealing with abstracts, property lines, ledgers, future profits. The human component was an unfortunate complication. "This parcel is unproductive. Your tithes are in arrears. The land is forfeit." Abel said nothing. He had argued for weeks, not about the tithes, but about the land itself. He had brought soil samples to the council, showed them the deep cracks, explained how the new irrigation channel upstream was draining the water table. He warned them the ground was becoming hollow, unstable. They had listened with polite, unyielding smiles. Davies had called his concerns unfounded anxieties. The real reason was an open secret: a cattle baron wanted a straighter path to the railhead, and Abel's farm was in the way. "You have until midday tomorrow to vacate," Davies continued, his voice flat. "The pass to the western settlements is still open. If you leave now, you should make it before the first heavy snow." He said it as a kindness, a final administrative generosity. But they both knew it was a death sentence. The weather signs were clear. The pass would be buried within the week. To be caught in it was to be lost. The townspeople watched from a distance, small figures huddled near their own homes, their silence a form of consensus. They had their own fields to worry about, their own families to feed. Abel's problem was his own. He had always been apart, a man who listened to the earth more than to his neighbors. His warnings had been taken as arrogance. Now, his eviction was seen as a natural consequence. He was difficult. He was being removed. Abel finally looked at Davies. His eyes were the color of wet slate. He did not plead. He did not bargain. He simply nodded once, a gesture of such finality that it seemed to take all the air from between them. Davies shifted, uncomfortable with the lack of expected drama. He cleared his throat, tipped his hat to Miriam, and walked back to his horse, the wind whipping his coat tails. Abel watched him go. Then he turned, pulled the nail from the doorframe with his bare fingers, and folded the notice. He did not crumple it. He folded it into a neat square, a thing to be put away, a chapter closed. Miriam placed a hand on his arm. It was small and bird-like, but the pressure was firm. He looked down at her. Her gaze was steady. She held a small, perfectly smooth river stone in her other palm, rubbing its surface with her thumb, a habit as old as his memory. The work had to begin. The wagon was not loaded for a long journey. It was loaded for survival. Sacks of flour and seed grain, not furniture. Smoked meats and dried beans, not heirlooms. Tools, not trinkets. By dawn, the house was a hollow shell. The wind moaned through its empty door. Abel hitched their old mule, its breath pluming in the frigid air. Miriam climbed onto the wagon seat, Moss leaping up beside her. Abel did not look back at the sod house. He looked north, toward the jagged line of bluffs that everyone else ignored. They were considered badlands, a place of useless rock and shadow. Davies had told him to go west. So Abel turned the wagon east, and then north, directly into the wind, away from the path of sense and safety, toward a place that held a different kind of promise. The people who saw them leave assumed they were lost to pride, marching toward a quicker end. They saw a stubborn man and a frail old woman heading for their graves. They watched until the wagon was a small, dark speck against the immense, indifferent gray of the sky, and then they went inside to brace for the coming storm. They did not know that Abel carried a map, not of roads, but of what lay beneath them. He was not running from the winter. He was heading for a place he had prepared to meet it. The bluffs rose from the plains like broken teeth. No one farmed here. No one grazed their animals. The ground was a treacherous mix of sharp rock and sudden sinkholes, covered in brittle, thorny scrub. To the town, it was a wasteland. To Abel, it was a text he had been studying for years. He stopped the wagon at the base of a sheer rock face, a place that offered no shelter at all from the wind. Miriam waited, her faith in him a silent, unshakable thing. Moss whined, sniffing the air, his tail giving a few tentative thumps against the wagon bed. Abel retrieved the map from an oilskin pouch. It was not a land office map of claims and boundaries. It was a geological survey, brittle with age, drawn by a government man who had passed through decades ago. His father, another man who trusted rock more than talk, had traded a winter's worth of firewood for it. In a corner, near the formation where they now stood, was a faint pencil annotation in his father's hand. Cast. Hollow. Watch the breath. Abel began to walk the base of the cliff, his eye scanning not for a cave opening, but for signs. He looked for specific types of vegetation, plants that thrived in limestone-rich soil. He looked for the subtle depressions in the earth that signaled collapsed chambers below. Moss jumped from the wagon and ran ahead, his nose to the ground. The dog was agitated, drawn by a scent or a sound Abel couldn't perceive. He stopped at a thicket of overgrown hawthorn, so dense it looked like a solid wall. Moss began to dig frantically at its base, whimpering with excitement. Abel pulled the dog back and began to cut away the thorny branches with his axe. Behind the curtain of thorns was not solid rock, but a dark opening no bigger than a barrel. It looked like a wolf den or a foxhole. A cold, dead space. But as Abel knelt, he felt it. A faint, almost imperceptible current of air flowed out of the opening. It was not the frigid, biting wind of the plains. It was cool, but it was distinctly warmer than the air outside. It smelled of deep earth, of damp stone and minerals. The cave was breathing. His father's words on the map were true. This was not just a hole, it was an entrance to a system. He lit a lantern. The light pushed back the darkness only a few feet, revealing a narrow passage that sloped steeply downwards. He tied a rope to the wagon and the other end around his waist, handing the lantern to his mother. "Wait for my signal," he said. She nodded, her hand gripping the warm metal, her knuckles white. He squeezed into the passage, the rock scraping his shoulders. It was tight, claustrophobic. After 20 feet, it opened into a larger chamber. The air was still and heavy. The lantern light showed walls slick with moisture and a floor of uneven, broken rock. It was a cold, inhospitable space, but it was out of the wind. That was the first requirement. He tugged on the rope 3 times, the signal that it was safe. He helped Miriam down, then the dog. He unloaded the wagon piece by piece, a grueling, repetitive labor that stretched for hours. Sacks of flour, tools, blankets, the precious crate with the sourdough starter. The last light of day was fading as he dragged the empty wagon into the hawthorn thicket to hide it from view. Inside, the chamber was a small island of their belongings in a vast, silent darkness. The first test was passed. They were out of the wind. The second, harder test was about to begin. The cold in the cave was a different kind of cold. It was not the sharp, aggressive cold of the wind, but a deep, penetrating dampness that settled in the bones. Abel's first priority was a fire. He had brought a small supply of dry wood from his farm, knowing there would be none on the bluffs. He found a relatively flat area near the back of the main chamber and built a small, careful stack of kindling and split logs. Miriam huddled in a blanket, moss curled at her feet, their breaths visible clouds in the lantern light. The first spark from the flint caught, and a tiny flame flickered to life. It grew, catching the larger pieces of wood, and for a moment, a wave of primitive comfort washed over them. The light pushed the immense darkness back, the heat began to fight the chill. Then came the smoke. It did not rise. It billowed out from the fire, thick and acrid, a choking grey cloud that spread rapidly through the chamber. It had nowhere to go. The smoke hugged the low ceiling and then began to sink, filling the space from the top down. Within minutes, their eyes were streaming. Coughing echoed off the stone walls, a harsh, tearing sound. Abel tried to wave the smoke towards the entrance passage, but it was no use. The airflow that had felt like a promise was too faint, too slow. The smoke poured back in as fast as he could push it out. Miriam's coughing became a desperate, wheezing gasp. He had to put it out. He smothered the flames with a damp sack, plunging them back into near darkness, the single lantern casting long, dancing shadows. The chamber was now filled with a foul, lingering haze that made every breath a painful effort. The failure was total and immediate. The cave was not a shelter, it was a tomb waiting to be sealed. The life-giving fire was a poison. They could not stay inside. Defeated, they retreated to the entrance passage, where the faint current of fresh air offered some relief, but the cold was almost as bad as it was outside. They spent the night huddled there, wrapped in every blanket they owned, listening to the wind howl over the plains and the drip of water in the dark, unbreathable chamber behind them. The hope that had sustained them through the eviction and the journey curdled into a cold knot of dread. He had brought his mother to this place to save her, and he had nearly suffocated her. Sleep was impossible. The failure of the fire was a physical presence in the dark, a cold weight on Abel's chest. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the smoke billowing back, heard his mother's ragged coughing. He had misread the signs. He had traded a slow death on the plains for a fast one in the rock. But as dawn approached, a sliver of grey light at the entrance, his mind turned back to the map. Vents. Not vent. Plural. The cave did not just breathe out, it must also breathe in. A system requires a cycle. The air he felt at the entrance was an exhalation. There had to be an inhalation somewhere else, higher up. The fire had failed because he had built it in the lungs, not in a hearth connected to a chimney. He had treated the cave like a room when it was an organism. He had to understand its anatomy before he could live inside it. Leaving Miriam and Moss wrapped in blankets near the entrance, he took the lantern and a ball of twine and went back into the smoky, cold chamber. He needed to see where the air went. He lit a small bundle of damp sagebrush. It produced a thick, aromatic white smoke, easier to track than the acrid wood smoke. He placed it on the floor. The smoke swirled, then, instead of rising, it drifted slowly but surely away from the entrance, towards the back of the chamber and into a narrow fissure he hadn't noticed before. The fissure was not a dead end. The smoke was being pulled into it. This was the cave's circulatory system at work. He followed, paying out the twine so he wouldn't get lost. The passage twisted and turned, sometimes forcing him to crawl on his hands and knees. The draft grew stronger here, a steady, pulling current. It led him to a second, smaller chamber, and then upwards, into a steep, debris-choked shaft that rose into absolute blackness. This was the chimney. He held the lantern up. The light was swallowed by the dark, but he could feel the pull of air, a steady upward flow. It was blocked, but not completely. He had found the flue. The work was brutal and dangerous. He built a crude scaffold of rocks to stand on and began the painstaking process of clearing the blockage from below. Dirt, loose stones, and ancient animal bones rained down on him. He worked with a small shovel and his hands, filling a bucket and carrying it back to the main chamber, dumping the debris in a far corner. He wore a cloth over his mouth and nose, but the dust was a constant, gritty presence in his throat and lungs. For 3 days, he did nothing but dig upwards into the dark. Miriam brought him water and bread, her presence a silent encouragement. On the third afternoon, something shifted. A cascade of pebbles was followed by a sliver of pale, grey light. He had broken through to the surface. He worked with renewed urgency, widening the opening until a column of daylight pierced the subterranean gloom. Looking up, he could see a small patch of sky. He had built his chimney. Now he needed a hearth. He used the flat stones he had cleared from the floor and clay mixed with grass to build a low, solid fireplace against the rock wall, carefully angled to draw the smoke towards the newly cleared flue. He constructed it with the same precision he had once used to build his fences, every stone placed with purpose. That evening, he laid a new fire. He struck the flint, and the kindling caught. The flame grew, and the smoke, instead of billowing into the chamber, rose in a clean, straight line and was pulled into the flue, disappearing into the rock. A steady, radiant warmth began to spread through the cave. Miriam came and stood beside him, holding her hands out to the heat. She looked at him, and in the firelight, he saw not just relief, but a quiet, profound affirmation. With a reliable source of warmth, the cave began the slow transformation from a hostile space into a home. The constant, penetrating dampness started to recede as the stone walls absorbed the heat from the fire. Abel built raised sleeping platforms from the salvaged planks of his wagon bed, lifting them off the cold stone floor to create a pocket of warmer air beneath. He used the wagon's canvas cover, stretched and tied to wooden posts wedged into the rock, to create a partition, separating their sleeping area from the main living space. This small act of division gave the chamber a sense of order and purpose, a semblance of rooms within the larger void. The cave was vast, but their life within it became focused and contained, centered around the hearth. The fire was no longer just for heat, it was the heart of their new world. Every activity revolved around it. Miriam would sit near its warmth for hours, her fingers busy mending their clothes, the river stone resting on the rock beside her. Moss, the dog, found a permanent spot on a worn blanket, his shaggy coat soaking up the radiant heat. The most critical task came next. From a carefully packed wooden crate, Abel retrieved a small, unassuming clay jar. Inside was a bubbling, pale mass with a sharp, tangy smell. It was Miriam's sourdough starter, a living thing passed down from her own mother, a continuous line of resilience kept alive with flour and water. In the ruin of their old life, they had saved this. It was more than just a leavening agent, it was their connection to the past and their best hope for the future. Abel's next construction project was an oven. He had seen pictures of earthen ovens in a book once, designs that were both ancient and brutally efficient. Using the same clay and grass mixture he'd used for the hearth, he began to build a dome-shaped oven into a natural alcove in the cave wall, venting it cleverly into the main chimney flue. It was slow, layered work. Each application of clay had to dry before the next could be added. While it cured, he turned his attention to another problem: food. Their sacks of flour would not last forever. He took a portion of their seed grain, wheat and barley meant for spring planting, and laid it out in shallow wooden trays he had built. He placed the trays on a rock shelf near the fire, where the ambient warmth was constant. He moistened the grain. Within days, tiny green shoots began to emerge. It was a small, vital miracle of green in the monochrome world of stone. When the oven was finally dry, the moment of truth arrived. Miriam prepared the dough, her movements practiced and sure a familiar rhythm in a strange new place. Abel heated the oven for hours, feeding it with wood until the interior clay glowed faintly. He swept out the coals and slid the pale, shaped loaf onto the hot stone floor. He sealed the opening with a flat rock. They waited. The air in the cave, already filled with the scent of wood smoke, now began to carry a new aroma, the rich, wholesome smell of baking bread. It was a smell of stability, of domesticity, of life itself. When he pulled the loaf out, its crust was a deep, perfect brown, and a tap on its underside produced a hollow, satisfying sound. He placed it on a wooden board to cool. Steam rose from its cracked surface, a visible exhalation of success. He cut a thick slice and handed it to his mother. She took it, her eyes closed for a moment as she held its warmth to her cheek. This was the first true harvest of their new life. It was proof that they could not only survive here, but potentially thrive. The purpose had shifted. It was no longer about enduring the winter, but about building a system that could sustain them through it, a system of warmth, growth, and nourishment, hidden away in the heart of the rock. The blizzard arrived not as a gradual decline, but as a sudden, violent assault. The wind, which had been a constant presence, rose to a frantic shriek. Snow began to fall, not as flakes, but as a solid, driving wall of white that erased the world. For days, the storm raged without pause. Inside the cave, they were insulated from the wind's fury, the sound muted to a distant, hollow roar. The fire burned steadily, the chimney drew perfectly, and the warmth was a shield against the lethal cold outside. Abel had dug a secondary tunnel from the main chamber to a small, sheltered alcove just behind the hawthorn thicket, creating a protected airlock. It meant they could check the entrance without exposing their living space to the full force of the storm. On the third day of the blizzard, he looked out to see that the snow had completely buried the main entrance, sealing them in. The hawthorn branches were just faint dark lines beneath a deep, seamless drift. They were now truly underground. A new and more insidious problem began to emerge. The warmth from the fire, meeting the deep cold of the surrounding rock, created condensation. The ceiling and walls began to weep. Water trickled down in slow, persistent rivulets, making everything clammy and damp. A fine layer of moisture coated their tools. Their blankets felt heavy and cold. Worst of all, the damp threatened their precious stores of flour and grain. Mold, a far greater threat than the cold, was a real possibility. The cave that had protected them was now trying to rot them from the inside. This setback was more complex than the smoke. He could not simply build his way out of it. He had to observe, to understand the cave's hydrology as he had its ventilation. He spent a day just watching, tracing the paths of the water droplets, seeing where they pooled. The cave was not leaking, it was sweating. His solution was one of management, not elimination. He could not stop the condensation, but he could control where it went. He took his spade and began to dig a series of shallow, narrow channels in the packed earth floor. It was meticulous work. He started from the dampest walls, carefully grading the channels at a slight, almost imperceptible angle. They snaked across the floor, intersecting, diverting the water away from their living and storage areas. He directed them all toward a low point in the far corner of the chamber, where he dug a deeper hole, a sump for the water to collect. He lined the channels with smooth, flat stones he had found deeper in the cave system, creating a miniature, functional aqueduct. It was an elegant piece of engineering born of pure necessity. Miriam watched him work. When he was finished, she walked over to the spot where the main channels converged and placed her own polished river stone there, setting it carefully among the others. It was a small, silent gesture, a blessing on his ingenuity. The system worked. The water now flowed obediently along its designated paths, leaving their living space dry and warm. The air still felt humid, but the direct threat of damp was gone. He had met the cave's next challenge not with force, but with understanding. He was not its conqueror, but its partner. Weeks bled into one another, marked only by the rhythm of baking bread and tending the sprouting grains. The world outside their sealed entrance was a blank abstraction. The blizzard eventually broke, but the silence that followed was just as profound. It was the silence of a world buried under 10 feet of snow. Dr. Finch was a man driven by a stubborn sense of duty. While the town council rationed supplies and debated the structural integrity of the snow-laden roofs, he worried about the families on the outlying homesteads. He packed a medical bag, strapped on a pair of heavy wooden snowshoes, and set out into the blinding white landscape. His first few stops confirmed his fears. Families were isolated, running low on food and firewood, their livestock suffering. But they were alive. His final destination was a formality, a grim task he felt obligated to perform. He headed for the bluffs. He expected to find Abel's wagon overturned, or perhaps just the frozen, windswept remains of the man and his mother, a monument to pride and poor judgment. As he drew closer to the rock formations, the silence was absolute. There were no tracks, no smoke, no sign that anyone had ever been there. The snow was a pristine, undulating blanket. He was about to turn back, his grim assumptions confirmed, when a slight shift in the wind brought him a scent. It was so faint, so improbable, that he thought he was imagining it. Wood smoke. And something else, something warm and yeasty. The smell of baking bread. It made no sense. He scanned the rock face, his eyes squinting against the glare. There was nothing. He began to walk, following his nose, a strange and unlikely compass. The scent grew stronger, pulling him toward a massive snowdrift piled against the cliff. At its base, nearly invisible, was a dark patch, a hint of something beneath the snow. It was the top of the hawthorn thicket. And from somewhere within that drift, a thin, almost invisible plume of heat haze and smoke rose into the frigid air. He approached cautiously, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" His voice was swallowed by the snow. He called again, louder. A section of the snowdrift shifted. A canvas flap was pulled aside, and a figure emerged from a dark tunnel, blinking in the bright light. It was Abel. He was not gaunt or frostbitten. He was steady, his face grim but healthy. He held a shovel. Behind him, from the darkness of the tunnel, the doctor could feel a wave of impossible warmth. Dr. Finch could not reconcile what he was seeing. He stood before the entrance to the cave, the cold air at his back and a current of warm, bread-scented air washing over him from the tunnel. Abel stood aside, a silent invitation. The doctor stepped through the canvas flap and into the airlock passage, then into the main chamber. The shock of it made him stop dead. The space was enormous, lit by the steady glow of a large, perfectly drawing fire and several well-placed lanterns. It was warm. It was dry. Against one wall, a woman he recognized as Miriam sat in a chair cobbled from wagon parts, mending a blanket, a shaggy brown dog at her feet. She looked frail, but her color was good. He saw the raised sleeping platforms, the neat stacks of firewood, the ingenious earthen oven built into the rock. He saw trays of vibrant green shoots growing near the fire. He saw sacks of flour, barrels of water, and on a wooden plank, 3 freshly baked loaves of bread, cooling. It was not a desperate hovel. It was an ordered, functional, and entirely self-sufficient world. "How?" Finch asked, his voice barely a whisper. Abel did not offer a long explanation. He gestured to the flue, the water channels on the floor, the oven. The evidence was all there. The system spoke for itself. Finch, a man of science and observation, understood immediately the sheer scale of ingenuity and labor it represented. His sense of awe was quickly replaced by a heavy dread. He had not come only to check on the dead. He had come bearing bad news. "Abel," he began, his voice heavy, "the town is in trouble." He described the blizzard, how it had lasted longer and dropped more snow than anyone in living memory could recall. He told him about the roof of the communal storehouse. Davies had dismissed concerns about its weakened beams just a month before the storm. It had collapsed 2 nights ago under the weight of the snow. "We lost most of it," Finch said, his face etched with worry. "The flour is ruined. The salt, the sugar, all of it. Soaked and frozen. What little people have in their own larders won't last another week. We're already seeing sickness. The children are hungry." The profound irony of the situation settled in the warm air of the cave. The community that had cast Abel out, that had passively watched him march toward what they assumed was his death, was now facing starvation. The man they had deemed unproductive and worthless was standing in the midst of abundance, his competence a silent, damning judgment on their own lack of foresight. Abel listened without expression. His face was a mask of stone, revealing nothing of his thoughts. He did not say "I told you so." He did not recite the warnings he had given about the unstable land, about the coming winter, about the town's complacency. He did not point out that the same institutional blindness that had evicted him had now doomed the town's food supply. There was no flicker of triumph in his eyes, no hint of satisfaction. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Finch expected a refusal, or at the very least, a bitter lecture. He would have deserved it. The town would have deserved it. Instead, Abel turned, walked to the plank where the loaves of bread were cooling, and picked one up. It was still warm. He took a clean linen cloth, wrapped the loaf carefully, and handed it to the doctor. Then he went to the trays of sprouting grain, harvested a handful of the tender green shoots, and placed them in a small cloth sack. He handed that to Finch as well. He said nothing. The act itself was the only communication necessary. It was not an act of forgiveness. It was an act of profound and quiet competence. It was an answer to a problem. Hunger was the problem. Here was the solution. Finch took the bread and the greens, his hand trembling slightly. He felt the weight of them, not just as food, but as a rebuke far more powerful than any words. He had come to the wilderness expecting to find a tragedy, and instead had found the town's only hope. Finch's return to the town was a quiet cataclysm. He did not stride into the town hall and make a grand announcement. He went to the makeshift infirmary where the sickest children were being tended to. He broke the bread. He gave a piece to each child, a piece to each worried mother. The effect was immediate and profound. It was real food, wholesome and nourishing, in a town that had been subsisting on thin soup and fear. The news spread not like a wildfire, but like a rising tide, an inescapable truth that washed through every home. The bread came from Abel. Abel was alive. When Finch finally stood before the town council, with Mr. Davies at its head, he did not need to raise his voice. He simply told them what he had seen. He described the warm, dry cave, the earthen oven, the trays of growing food. He described a system built on foresight and hard labor. Davies scoffed. He found a hot spring, a geological fluke. He got lucky, but the words rang hollow. Luck did not bake bread. Luck did not build a chimney through solid rock. The people in the room, their own larders empty, looked at the half-eaten loaf Finch had placed on the table. The evidence was irrefutable. Their leader's judgment had failed them. The outcast's judgment had not. A few days later, a small party of men set out for the bluffs. Dr. Finch led them. They were not a posse. They were petitioners. They pulled sleds loaded not with demands, but with what little they had to offer in trade, a few smoked hams, some lamp oil, a bolt of wool cloth. Davies was not among them. His authority had evaporated overnight, not in a storm of anger, but in a quiet, collective turning away. He had been rendered irrelevant by a loaf of bread. When the party reached the cave, Abel was waiting for them at the entrance. He stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. The men stopped a few feet away, their bravado gone, replaced by a humble, desperate uncertainty. One of them, a blacksmith whose son had been the first to eat the bread, stepped forward. "Abel," he said, his voice rough. We need help. We were wrong." He gestured to the sleds. "We've brought what we can label." Looked at the men, then at the meager offerings on the sleds. He gave a short, sharp nod. It was all the answer they needed. There was no ground reconciliation. There were no apologies demanded or given. The past was a frozen landscape they had all crossed to get here. What mattered was the present. Abel did not simply give them food. He brought them into the cave, two at a time, and showed them the system. He showed them how the oven worked, how to manage the heat, how to mix the dough using the living starter. He explained the simple logic of the sprouting trays, how to turn dormant seed into living food. He was not giving them a fish, he was describing the net. He took a portion of Miriam's precious sourdough starter, scooped it into a jar they had brought, and handed it to the blacksmith. "Feed it every day," he said. It was the first full sentence he had spoken to any of them. The instructions were a transfer of knowledge, not charity. He was giving them the means to save themselves. They watched, they learned, and they worked. They transported sacks of their own flour, what hadn't been ruined, to the cave, and under Abel's quiet supervision, they began the cycle of baking that would keep the town from starving. The cave became a temporary community bakery, a place of warmth and labor in the heart of the cold. Abel never joined them in the town. He remained in his shelter, a fixed point of competence they now orbited. The judgment had been inverted. The outcast had become the anchor. The final image of that winter was not of a town saved, but of a quiet, enduring reality. Abel sat by his fire, sharpening an axe, the rhythmic scrape of stone on steel a steady, patient sound. Moss slept at his feet. And Miriam, in her chair, held the smooth river stone in her hand, its surface warmed by the fire, a small, solid piece of a world that had been built, not found.